For our next example, we're going to take a look at the for counter project, which is located in the fig06_02 folder. And I'm going to go ahead and open up that project. This example is going to demonstrate counter controlled iteration once again, this time using the for iteration statement. Now, counter controlled iteration can be performed with either the while or the for iteration statement, but generally it's preferred to use the for iteration statement because all of the elements of counter controlled iteration are summarized in a single line of code in the context of the for statement, whereas in the preceding example you saw there were 3 separate lines of code that accounted for all the elements of counter-controlled iteration in the context of the while iteration statement. And depending on how big the body of that while is, those statements could actually be in relatively distant portions of the code, so it may not be as clear what the elements of counter-controlled iteration are in the context of a while iteration statement. Now, before we look at this in detail, let's just run the program to prove that we get the exact same output as the first example in this lesson. So here at line 11 through line 14 is our for iteration statement. It's the for keyword followed by a required set of parentheses, and within that set of parentheses are 2 required semicolons. To the left of the first semicolon is where you can declare and initialize your counter variable. In this case, we happen to have named it counter once again. It is an integer variable, though it's not required to be. In most cases, you will count with integer variables. Its name is counter and its initial value is 1. Now, this section of the for statement's header, if you will, is executed once upon entering the for statement in the flow of control of the program. Then from there it goes to the counter less than or equal to 10 condition to determine whether counter's value is less than or equal to 10, and that's the same condition we had in the while statement's parentheses in the preceding example. If the condition is true, next the body executes. So here we're simply going to display the value of the counter once again. And when the closing curly brace of the body is reached, at that point is when the increment section executes to, in this case, add 1 to the counter. From there, program control goes back not to the declaration of the counter, but back to the loop continuation condition to determine whether the loop should iterate again. And as long as counter is still less than or equal to 10, then we will execute the body statement, then increment, then test the condition, then execute the body, then increment, etc., etc. When counter eventually becomes 11, we will jump down to line 16 to terminate the loop. So again, the nice thing about the for iteration statement is that it shows you all of the aspects of counter-controlled iteration in a single line of code. And for that reason, when you're doing counter-controlled iteration, you should generally use a for loop, whereas when you're doing sentinel-controlled iteration, that is typically implemented with a while iteration statement or possibly a do while statement, which we'll look at in a subsequent example.